Sometimes it feels like we're scrolling through life more than we're living it. Welcome to The Search Bar. I'm your host, Adam Sparks, and on today's episode, we're discussing the impact of social media on real-life experiences with Kirsten Weber, professor of communication at Central Michigan University. Thanks for coming in, Kirsten. I'm kind of excited to talk about social dynamics and how they're affected by our social media personas, right? Yeah. I thought this was going to be a really interesting conversation when I heard that we were going to have it. And one of the things that really jumped into my mind, and I'm sure you'll remember this moment too, is there's this really famous photograph, and it's of this woman leaning over a rail, and everybody else has a cell phone out.
Yeah.
Does that feel even more impactful now?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have seen the growth of it. I mean, given our ages, I remember when I didn't have a cell phone growing up, and I remember in college finally getting a cell phone, and then just seeing the way that cell phone use has infiltrated so much of our lives. And so, yeah, I think that now when we go to concerts or when we go out to weddings or whatever it is, that folks are often on their phone as opposed to being present in that moment. So there's certainly been a big shift, and there's a lot of research to back up that that's the trend that we're seeing.
I ran into a little study that was talking about how when you photograph something, it fundamentally changes the way you remember it, which doesn't seem like a bad thing at first. But when you start to read the research, I think it gets into a little bit of like, you forget how things smell, you forget how you were feeling, but you actually do lock in a little bit more on how something looked, right? Are there other ways that our experiences are changing there that we don't know about?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's actually a pretty well-known study. So when you're taking a photo, and this makes a lot of sense because photos are visual in nature, right? What we end up locking into our memory is the visual components of that. So there's a couple of studies that looked at people going to museums, like art museums. And so when they go to art museums and they're asked to just sort of like walk around however they normally would interact with things, they end up remembering a lot more of what you're talking about, these other senses. So things that they maybe smelled, things that they felt, how hard the floor was. And then if you compound that with, social interaction, right? They remember when their friend made the funny joke about the art, right? Or they remember that feeling that they got when they leaned against the person that they're looking at this famous piece of artwork. But if you tell people to go to the same museum and then they're taking pictures, they just remember visual elements of like the art or of, like angles, those types of things. And so it's not inherently bad to take a picture. It's just that you're truncating your experience to just a visual frame. And so that's where like using social media or being attached to our phones can become a little bit limiting or problematic in some ways because you're not going to get the full range of the experience. Whereas if you make a conscious effort, like that person, if you make the conscious effort to put your phone away, then you're going to have all of those other components of that experience, not only to live in that moment, right? But then when we remember those moments, having your phone out versus not having your phone out impacts that as well. So if you don't have your phone out, you're going to be more likely to be able to remember all of those components. And so when you think about the times that you have with your friends that are like the most exciting, right? It's probably when you're laughing about a joke, right? You're bringing up things and you're going to, remember that time we were watching the game and we were laughing, right?
Yeah.
That feels so good to remember that. But if you have your phone out, we don't have any of those memories. The only memories that we really have, and we don't really have like a solid memory of this either, is just like that you're taking pictures of things, right? Or that you're like looking at something that's on your phone. And so it almost, in some ways, having your phone out erases a lot of the experiences that we need to actually have memories, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I feel like there's probably a pressure there that we've developed that we feel like that's helping us remember those things. Because I think you're right. If I have an experience with my friends, and I took a picture of somebody and I remember that picture really well. There's a picture of a coworker I have here who I've been friends with since I started at Central 6+ years ago. And I'm holding a wine bottle up to her arm. She's really short arms and the wine bottle's about as long as her arm. And it's a party that I had. And I expressly remember that party and I always remember that picture, but I couldn't tell you what we talked about that day. I know it was a really good time, right? And I think that's sort of the pressure to take a photo sometimes is that thing, right? Where you kind of go, well, what were you doing on April 7th last year? And you go, I don't remember April 7th. But if you scroll on your phone to April 7th, you can go, oh, this is what I did. So I think, especially if you're a prolific social media user, you start to kind of go, well, this is my catalog for my, like, did my life even happen if I didn't catalog it, right? I feel like that pressure is there for us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, we have FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. And so I think that all gets wrapped up into this like desire to want to take pictures, to be able to catalog. And it's not necessarily problematic to take pictures. The problem is if we start to replace the experience with the taking of the photos, right? So it's a really different experience to go to this party and you have your friend and you're taking the wine bottle picture, right? That's, you know, that's being engaged with this person and you're taking this photo to sort of document the memory, right? Which is really different from if you go to the party and your focus on the party is like doing one of these, trying to like get the perfect angle and the perfect background. And so we're taking, you know, a half an hour to just take this photo so that we can find the perfect one, so that we can edit the perfect one, so that we can post it. We've then spent a half an hour of time that we could have been interacting with people, just interacting with our phone, right? Just like trying to find this perfect photo. And that's where we're really missing out on the social benefits of being with people, you know, having that experience versus you're just fixated on the phone and what the phone is going to do. We need to like start to think about the costs and benefits maybe of being present in a moment and really taking in like our senses of what we're experiencing there, taking in those feelings so that we can call upon them versus you're doing this other activity, right? When you should be watching the game.
And it's a distraction. I think we've gotten so good as a society, you know, count myself in here, as at thinking we're multitasking when we're doing social media things or we're doing recording of things. And we're really only good at doing maybe two things at once, right? And I think when you're on when you start adding the, how am I going to do this? Or is this going to line up to a certain sound that I want to post with or a song? Like I've been in multimedia for 20 years. And so often when I'm out capturing something, if somebody's with me, I'll ask them to look out for things for me, because when you get into that mode, you think that it's detail oriented enough because I'm looking, you know, I'm taking some pictures of Kirsten and I'm not going to, you might miss the most obvious thing because your brain is going through a whole separate process. So something that the person may say, or maybe there's just a big hair in their face or something. And you're thinking, well, surely you would catch that. You do this for a living. You do it all the time. And the answer is sometimes no, because I'm sort of in a different space when I'm inside the camera than I am if I were just here having a conversation with you now. I'd probably be far more likely to catch a big piece of hair in your face now than if I were photographing you or if I were taking video of you, which again, seems counterintuitive, but it's an experience that I certainly have all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you're talking about, there's actually a phenomenon. It's called inattentional blindness. And if you think about the amount of stimulus that we have every day, our brain just can't process all of that stimulus. So every day, like even right now, like there's multiple sounds that are going into your ears. There's multiple scents maybe, like you're feeling different things, like your clothes and the table and all these different things. And so our brain automatically tries to parse out some of that information that it thinks is less relevant. And so, yeah, a lot of times we're gonna miss things. And especially if we have the added distraction of a phone, we're gonna be even more likely to miss things. And, you know, phones are designed in this way to really make them really addictive. And so it's not just that, that we're gonna miss some things because our brain is sort of trying to make decisions so that we're not getting like erroneous information, but like, you know, they've akined using a phone with like doing cocaine, right? Like doing crack, because there's like a dopamine hit in your brain. And so chemically speaking, your brain, every time it looks at that screen, it's like, oh, this feels really, really good. And so your brain wants you to continue to do that. And so, I mean, my spouse, he teaches middle school. And so for a while, they had this policy where the kids could have their phones in between classes, so like every 40 minutes. And it's like micro, like, I don't know, like micro hitting your phone, because then it's like, oh, I get this dopamine. Now I'm supposed to listen for 40 minutes. Oh, now I'm going to get dopamine again. Now I have to listen.
It's like a cigarette break for when you worked in the restaurant.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it was. But, you know, these little undeveloped brains are sort of like having trouble managing, like, I want to do this thing, but, you know, it's,
And it feels like, especially younger people, probably struggle to find balance with it, right? I think like figuring out like how to, be able, because you can have positive social media interactions, right? I think those, while those certainly exist, I think it's hard to find a healthy balance when so much of life seems to be online, right? I know I struggle with this as a parent sometimes too. And it's like, we were just talking about, we both got our first cell phone in college.
Yeah.
So I'm like just at the age where like I got that as a young adult, but like I'm, especially as I'm like just barreling into middle age here, I'm finding myself putting my phone down for extended periods of time and just walking away from it and really appreciating something that I feel like maybe I lost in the last 20 years or so. How can people find balance? Like what's a good way for balance for like middle-aged adults, but even for middle-aged adults with like kids, or if you're, you work here and you're trying to get students to kind of, how do you tell them to balance it?
Yeah. Well, okay, so I want to answer balance, but I also want to answer something else that you said, because social media and phones are not inherently bad. And I want to make sure that that's clear. There are a lot of benefits to being able to interact with people through a mediated channel. So like one of the earlier studies that I did as a researcher, I was looking at breast cancer patients, and I was looking at social support for breast cancer patients, right? And you can imagine sort of like any type of disease, or, maybe particularly rare diseases, right? One of the things that's beneficial about social media is that we can connect with people in ways that we weren't able to do that before. And that's really, really important for healing for some people, because, if there's only one person in your town who has a particular disease like cystic fibrosis, right? That's a very uncommon disease. But you can interact with people through like a support group in another town, like that's going to make a really, really big difference. Or, when we think about broader crises that hit certain towns or areas, like being able to connect with other individuals to sort of rally resources, like it can be really, really good. So I want to emphasize that. Now, you sort of had this other question though, where like, how do we figure out the balance of using it for some of these really good things, but also recognizing that sometimes it can be distracting us from being present in our real lives? One of the things that you can do is start to be a little bit more mindful, and it sounds like you kind of had this intuitive sense to do that, which is recognizing...
I was running from my anxiety, to be clear.
Okay, running from your anxiety, or we're going to frame it as your intuitive sense to run from your anxiety.
I appreciate that, though.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's more like you just want to think about like, okay, what are you thinking or feeling right before you pick up your phone, right? And so for a lot of people, there's a lot of research that says that people are pretty bored, and that's really like the impetus for why they're picking up that phone, right? So like, what do I do while I sit here in the doctor's office? Okay, well, I'll just pick up my phone. Or what do I do while I'm walking to class or walking to, across campus? Well, I just pick up my phone, right? And so you want to think about like, what is that feeling that's driving it? And then you want to think about like, what are you orienting toward, right? So when you open up your phone, are you automatically going to social media? Are you playing Sudoku? Are you playing a different video game? Are you looking at pictures of your family, right? Like, what is the thing that you're doing? Then you want to reflect a little bit more on like, well, how did that make me feel, right? Like, did it feel good to spend 10 minutes while I was, waiting for my next class to play some, innocuous video game like, Candy Crush or something like that, right? Did that really feel, when you put that down, did you feel good, right? And then like, as you're sort of doing that calculation, you also want to be thinking about like, what are you missing out on by being on the phone, right? And like, that's like a key part of this formula, because we don't always consider what we could be doing. So you could be talking with the person next to you, right? And there's so much research that shows that like chatting with strangers or acquaintances, that makes us feel good, that makes them feel good, right? So you could be doing that. You could just be noticing the trees. We have so many just like components of campus that I just feel like I'm so drawn to, because it makes me feel good, right? You could just spend those 10 minutes like looking at the trees. And there's so much research that shows that like connecting yourself with nature is going to make you feel good. So you want to be thinking about what are those other things you could be doing. So, I talked about some campus examples, but like you're at home and you're bored, and so you pick up your phone, or you learn to play an instrument, or you learn a foreign language, or, you decide to connect with your kid, right? Like my kids love playing board games, right? And I don't always love board games. I like some board games, right? I'm not super, super competitive, so board games get a little weird for me. But, this weekend, at 2 different points, on 2 different days, my kids came up to me like, hey, can you play this board game with us? And I had like an option there, like, oh, could I play the board game? Could I just tell them no and easily slip onto my phone, right? Like either one of those is like totally viable. But what I did is I chose to play the board game with my kids, right? And now I have a memory of doing that with my kids, like connecting with them. And so we always have that choice in thinking about how do we really want to spend that time. And we have a finite amount of time, right? Like everybody only ever gets 24 hours, even though I swear I've been praying for more like my entire life, right? And so if you are spending 3 hours or 6 hours or whatever it is on a mediated channel and you're not spending, that time, playing a board game with your kids, like you're just not going to have the memories, right? So I think that's, thinking about what you're feeling, how, what you're turning toward, how it made you feel after that. And then like, what's the alternative? Like, what is the thing that you're missing out on, right? That can be a really powerful sort of like mindfulness activity so that you can start to think about, well, can I make this more balanced? Or do I want a different ratio of like screen time to this other type of interaction, right? So, and there's other things you can do. I mean, a lot of people talk about like detoxing and things like that. And so like, if you want to go cold turkey from something, you can, but I don't think it changes your underlying like belief system about the media versus the not media. Like there's a lot of research that shows like, yeah, go cold turkey and you're gonna feel good. Like there's boosts in like self-esteem and, less depression, less anxiety if you do that. But if you really wanna make like a long-term change, I would say like start to ask yourself like what do you really want and what are you gaining or missing from doing this?
Yeah.
So
I think that's really interesting. I like that you brought up mindfulness. It's like a theme that keeps popping up with guests on the search bar. Because it feels like sometimes when we talk about mindfulness, to me, it always feels like this game, this very modern game of mindfulness, which is that what did we used to do before we had to spend 10 minutes with ourselves without a phone?
Yeah.
Which is like hilarious. But to me now, mindfulness is like, I'm in line at Walgreens and the lady in front of me has got a full shopping cart and a lot of coupons. Oh, and a checkbook. And first of all, I'm trying not to be annoyed by that because what am I going to do? Why? It's not her fault. She's just doing what the coupons are there. She still has a checkbook. That's a decision.
Yeah.
It's just like listening to vinyl records, I guess, just in a different way.
Yeah.
But just not picking up my phone. And I think, for me, that's been an interesting exercise to put myself through because I think it's the immediate thing that we do when we're like, oh my gosh, I have to wait 6 minutes. Mm-hmm. And I was expecting to do something right away. But that's something that's 30 years ago, we would have just done, right? You'd have just waited in line. And I think you probably would have been less likely to be annoyed too, right? Do you think that attention spans are affected?
Yeah,
by this?
there's a lot of research that shows that attention spans are affected. And I think people just are, less likely to want to engage with each other because we don't have to do that as much, whereas before that's just what we did. If you think about the way that our world is shifting in terms of technology, it's moving us away from social interaction. Think about the checkout line, right? So you're behind the lady with the check, but nearly every store now has self-checkout, right? And so we're almost training ourselves to interact a little bit less, which is
not Walgreens on mission. Okay. No self-checkout there.
Well,
you're waiting for your grandmother with her checkbooks.
But here's the thing. You're absolutely right. So we aren't being placed in positions where we necessarily have to wait. And so it's sort of reinforcing that we shouldn't be waiting. And so we're more likely to get on our cell phone. And then, we have these hits of dopamine. And so, it's
the substitute social interaction comes in there because you can connect with 6 people when you're waiting in line there versus talking to the person behind you or the little old lady who's getting 17 boxes of Metamucil or whatever it is because they're on coupon. Yeah. I'm picking on all of the ladies who look like my grandmother who shop here. But I think that's sort of that thing that like you were saying, like I could be having a social interaction. I could be doing a thing, but I'm here and I'm getting maybe a specialized social interaction because maybe it's, maybe it's the person that, I'm getting similar hobbies or similar political beliefs as me. So I'm feeling connected with these people, but like, am I really, right? Like, is that a thing that we're tricking ourselves into too? I wonder where like you start to feel like people or their lives in a genuine way. And I think if we really think about it, most of us know better, right? Like your Instagram feed is not you, right?
Yeah. The way that social media is set up is we're getting a lot of those dopamine hits because of how frequently we're getting stimulating information. Like into our brains. I think like in terms of like the quality of those relationships is what you're getting at. And there's a lot of research that would say like that those are not high quality relationships, and that we do need high quality relationships to really be healthy. There's a couple different studies. One would suggest that like one of the ways that we use social relationships that are most beneficial to us, that like bring us most health and well-being, is that can we rely on that person during like a difficult time? And so if you think about that as being a standard for like, is this a quality relationship or not a quality relationship? Probably if you go to Instagram and are like, hey, my car broke down and I need a ride to work, and can somebody help me get my kid after school, right? That's what I need. You're not going to get that from like Instagram, right? Like that's just not going to happen. And so no, those aren't really high quality relationships, because they're not going to help you overcome like a difficult experience that you're having. Whereas if you have close friends, people here that are helping you with the podcast, right? Like those individuals you can call up and say like, hey, help me out, right? So, I mean, that's, I guess, a way of thinking about if those relationships are really helping you. I mean, it's not that they're always bad for you. It's just that you can't really rely on them. And so when push comes to shove, that's not going to help you. And that's a litmus test for like your well-being as it relates to having these relationships. I think another thing is there's a lot of research that shows that if you're just scrolling through, that is more detrimental to your well-being than if you are creating some type of content. So like if you are somebody who is going on there and commenting on people's posts and, oh, I really like this vacation photo, and here's a vacation photo that I took, doing something like that is healthier for you than if you're just scrolling. So if you're standing in line and your option is scrolling or talking to the lady who's buying a lot of Metamucil, you're going to get a lot more out of just having a chat with her and being like, why do you have 19 boxes of this? Tell me more about your life story, than if you just go on there and you're looking at some of these like faux representations of people's lives.
Yeah, maybe you'll find someone you relate to that you didn't think you would, right? I have chronic illness. We won't get into it. But it's especially when I encountered it for the first time, I was very young. Mm-hmm. And there was a celebrity that had also encountered the same thing. And I don't know this person. Yeah. And I, watching them go through it and be somebody who is famous for writing and documenting things, talk about it was really helpful. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to discount something like that, because it was interesting to see someone who like was getting a lot of public feedback go through a similar situation to me that was pretty scary and horrifying, and have them share that experience. Again, is it the same thing as getting it in person? No, but I was also in a situation where like there wasn't a lot of people around me where I could go, hey, remember when this thing happened? Because I was on a little bit of an island at the time. So, I guess I when we say all this, I want to say, there's still a positive thing there, but at some point, to your point, no matter how endeared I became to that person's online persona, they're of no direct input to me. So even if I'm having a problem in that area of my life where I've got a little bit of a unique situation, I'm probably still better off talking to my wife, versus I'm going to go back to that profile and, you know what I mean?
I think yes. And can I add to that?
Yeah.
So you're sort of talking about what we term in the field like intersubjectivity, right? So like you have a subjective experience that's sort of unique to you and experiencing whatever this ailment is, right? And so one of the reasons why connecting with that and sort of faux connecting with that celebrity was that you probably felt really validated in your experience by seeing what that person did. And so we call that intersubjectivity, like being able to understand the subjective experience to someone else. And that's something that's really key to a lot of unique experiences, and why it's so beneficial that we can reach out across like time and space to other people who have these experiences that we're having that are pretty unique, because it validates our experience. It feels like empathy, like they really understand. And so even though maybe you have a really, really good friend who can come and help you out when you're having a hard day or whatever, however your day is impacted by this ailment, there's something about knowing that somebody else truly understands, like they feel this thing that matters for us as humans. And so, like I said before, when I was doing this research on breast cancer patients, and I've done this type of research in a number of other areas, like with other chronic diseases, other sort of rare diseases, some of them being chronic, that having that inner subjective support from somebody, it really does make a difference. So I think you're right in what you said, in that it makes so much sense to me as a scholar that you felt connected to this person and that made a difference for you, and that you recognize that probably your spouse, your wife, right, that she probably like can offer support in a really different way than some like sort of nebulous celebrity that's out there. So they both make a difference. Yeah.
I only said it because I just felt like, I when we talk about these things, I think there's a little bit of a cautionary tone, which is, it's earned, right? Again, because I think if everyone's honest with themselves, they know that sometimes their relationship with their social media platforms probably isn't the healthiest, but it's also like there's a nebulous is a good word. It's a little bit nebulous. Like there is a gray area that we're trying to operate here where we're going to hopefully feel better, do better. In family dynamics, when it comes to these things, what's the advice you have for managing teenagers with this? Because I imagine that or even just younger people, us as parents talking about this have a very different feeling about like what our relationship with our phone should be versus probably what our kids do. And I imagine that there's a big gap there generationally, like with how it's viewed positively and negatively, like what the discipline level is for like putting a phone down.
Yeah. I think it's really complex. Like there's not, I don't think, a really easy answer for that. I mean, some of the research shows things like young girls in particular experience a lot of like bullying through like text and things like that during the middle school years. And so you should wait until at least high school. There's some sort of similar trends with boys and like gaming and those types of things and like viewing sexual content. And so there's sort of this general recommendation that waiting until high school makes a lot of sense. But I think like if you want to have like a broader, more in-depth conversation, you have to think about things like right now, a lot of kids, that is how they connect with each other. And so if they don't have a phone to be able to connect to each other, or they don't have some mediated form to connect to each other, most people don't have landlines anymore, right? And so like one of the things that we did is, instead of having a landline and instead of giving our kids cell phones when they were pretty young, is we just had a cell phone that sat on the kitchen counter, right? And it was just plugged into the wall there, and the kids couldn't really bring it anywhere. But if they needed to like, or wanted to like call grandma or call whoever, like they could do that, because it's important that they learn how to have those conversations. Like if you've talked with a pretty young kid on a cell phone, they don't know how to have the conversation. They sort of pick up the conversation like partway through it, and so learning the basic like, hello, this is so-and-so, how are you? Okay, like they need to learn that. And so giving them some early exposure can be really, really helpful. And that's what we got when we, had landlines, right? Because then there's somebody sort of telling you like, oh, we don't do this, right?
Yeah. And the phone rang in the house all the time.
Yeah, right?
At some age you were like, okay.
And so like part of it is just learning those rules. So like my one of my sons the other day, he sent out a text message, again on this, using this phone, he sent out a text message to everybody that he knows, and he introduced everybody on the text message to everybody else. And then of course everybody freaked out because this is like 30 people, and it was like my mom and his friend from school and somebody from, like practice, and they were like, who are these people and why do they all, right? So like I think part of this is like, we have to teach them the etiquette of phones, right? But we have to do it in sort of a safe way. And we have to let them learn how to socialize with each other, because if they don't have access to something that allows them to socialize, then they're just going to be isolated in their rooms, and we don't really want that, right? But then, there's other things like, how do we have conversations with them about things that are sort of difficult, like sexting, right? Like we have to have those conversations with them. And so this is where kind of going back to that mindfulness conversation maybe matters, because you can have that same conversation with your kid and say like, how did this feel, right? Like, did you like this? Did you not like this? Here's the consequence of doing this type of thing. What do you think about that? My other son, so he's in high school, and he has his own cell phone right now. And when he first got that, the conversations that we had pretty frequently were like, I see that you're using it in this way. how is it making you feel to use it in that way, right? Have you tried to do this thing? I've noticed that you've done this, right? And so then he starts to internalize the same dialogue that we should be having with ourselves about, does this feel good? If I'm doing this, then I'm not doing this with my friends, or I'm not doing this to sort of, I don't know, play music or improve myself or whatever it might be, right? And then, having conversations too about like, what are different types of phone activities that you can engage in? Because they're not all exactly the same, right? Like some of it is, I'm listening to music on, like on Pandora. Is that the same as if I'm just like scrolling through social media, right?
I would think not.
Yeah, and it's not, right? They're doing sort of different things. They're stimulating your brain in different ways, right? And so having those conversations with them, and not just saying like, you absolutely can't do this, but like get them to start to ask the questions that you're asking, right? The ones that you're sort of afraid to ask of them, just ask them those questions. And then they start to have that dialogue in their mind. And so then they start to make different decisions. I mean, this is like I don't want to tell parents exactly what to do. This is something that I struggle with as a parent, because there's a lot of, opportunities out there to put programming on the phone so that you just turn it off or turn it on, right? And it's like, oh, should we use this? Should we not use this? And I think my answer is like yes and no. If you don't let kids or anybody make mistakes, they can't really learn from it. And so part of like letting your kid learn about social media right now, or learning about playing games on their phone, might be that they need to make a couple mistakes. But then, you also have to keep in mind, kids' brains are undeveloped, right? They don't have the self-control that a 30 or 40 or 50 or an 80-year-old is going to have. And so sometimes you need to have some guardrails up to help them, just like there's guardrails up around driving. We found that kids get distracted when they're driving, and so there's more laws now that say like you can only drive alone, or you can only drive with a family member. You can't drive with 10 of your friends, right? And so sometimes providing some of those guardrails can be really helpful, just because they don't have the same level of impulse control, or they don't have the same level of like decision making that somebody a little bit older might have. So it's a complex thing, and you just kind of want to think through.
Yeah, self-awareness comes later in life. I mean, it's just the reality of it.
We're all working on it, right?
We all, yeah. I mean, it's gradual, but it comes eventually. Yeah, when you're saying, you're talking about like more having guardrails than just like maybe these things. So it's yes, no, yes, no. I think asking your kids why they use things the way they are, what the rules are to them, like what are the perceived rules within your friend group or within your school in terms of like how you're interacting with each other. Because I think it's important to hear your kids where they're at with that, because it's very easy to just apply the rules that you had growing up. Like, why don't you do this? Because there are times when like I find the teenagers to be frustrating in the way they want to engage with each other, because I'm like, well, I would have just done this. Well, I didn't live under the same rules or circumstances that you did either. So it's really not fair for me to expect you to approach a social problem or a social situation the same way that I did, because I did have a phone with a really long cord in my house.
Yeah.
I did go to my friend's house and scream outside at their window to get them to come out. Like it was just
That's what we did. Yeah.
right. And it's cute. It's the nostalgia of that is fun for anyone who's like over 36, over 37, maybe to like hear that. But there's not a version of that exists in most neighborhoods anymore. So why should I actually be frustrated with my kid when their first means of interacting with their friends is Snapchat? It's like, well, who sent me this, or how am I supposed to get a hold of so-and-so? I sent it to the group Snap and only so-and-so replied. And I'm just like, but can't you text them directly? No one uses text,
Yeah.
I have an exchange student right now. It's all WhatsApp with them. And it's sort of like, it's a very different experience too, to hear them say these things and be like, I'm going to handle it all here before I ever handle it in person or before I make a phone call. One thing that happens inside of these family groups, certainly happens in my family sometimes, but I think just in social circles in general, is people being with other people, but still choosing the phone when they're with that person who might be that real life interaction.
Yeah.
How do we manage that? Is that something that's happening everywhere? I assume it is, but
Yeah, I mean, if you go, I think we talked earlier I mentioned like concerts, you go to concerts, if you go to like a political rally, you know, that's something that's timely right now. Like you'll see everybody sort of has their phone up, right? But it also happens in like interpersonal interaction. So if people are going out to dinner, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, somebody has their phone out, right? Or, you know, if you're even at home, I mean, this happens with parents and kids, and they find that actually like that parents are doing this quite a bit, and it's impacting the well-being of the kids, because then the kids aren't getting the social interaction that they need to be able to just sort of be socialized into being a human, right? But just more generally, they're feeling alone, right? Because their parents aren't responding to them. So it's certainly something that we see in families, and it's pretty broad-based what we're seeing. And it's, you know, it's problematic. I mean, we need to start thinking about that. One of the I guess findings that I like to talk about sometimes is that this matters a lot for having high quality exchanges with people. So there's two instances, well, I guess like two circumstances that exacerbate this in some ways. Like one is if you're having an important conversation with somebody. So let's say you want to talk with your spouse because you're feeling upset about something. If you have your phone out during that conversation, it just makes it worse. People anticipate that there's going to be an interruption. Sometimes there is a real interruption. People feel just by having that phone out like that it, you know, you're going to get ignored or something like that in some way. So if you're having a meaningful conversation, you just got to put the technology away. The other thing is, and I sort of mentioned this, but just having it out in general makes conversations worse. And so you really don't want to have them out for the important conversations, but just like having it out, people automatically feel a little less seen and a little less heard. And so you just need to be conscientious of that. Like, is that the way that you want people to be feeling, right? You probably don't want people to be feeling that way. And so just putting the phone away is going to automatically make you appear to be a better communicator, like a better, you know, more supportive friend, like all of those things. So you really, I mean, it just having it out is kind of, I mean, it's challenging for relationships.
Right. And what value is it really adding? Usually it's notifications of like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Birkenstock's trying to sell me some new shoes. Can't not look at that one when it pops up on my Gmail, right? I mean, when I am guilty of doing that,
yeah.
I find that those are often the things that I am like just swiping to clear off my phone. And then why?
I mean, can I piggyback off of that a little bit?
Yeah,
Like,
please.
I mean, this is like, I sort of geek out on communication and like the way that the brain works. I mean, if you just think about visual stimulus, right? Like your brain only has enough capacity for visual stimulus. And so, I mean, there's research that shows this, like you can't really multitask. I mean, not just you, none of us can really multitask very well, right? And it's just the way that the brain works in terms of processing information. So if you are looking at your phone, your brain is taking in the visual stimulus there. And I can't take in the visual stimulus of your face too. And so like you have to choose one or the other. And it's the same thing with like auditory stimulus too. Like you either get to listen to the music or you get to listen to the ad or you get to listen to the person. So in addition to it just being sort of rude and people feeling slighted, your brain can't do that. And so when you go to recall that conversation, you're not going to be able to recall it as well, because half of the audio stimulus that you got in your brain is going to be that advertisement, and half of it is going to be like the thing that the person was saying to you. And I sort of did this experiment in class. You were talking about anecdotal things. So sometimes when I teach like listening skills, like communication and listening skills, active listening skills, I make my students have a conversation and I play music at the same time. And this conversation's sort of structured, and I have this music, right? And then I have them try to come back and report like, what was it that you talked about? And more times than not, their conversation gets impacted by the song that is being played. And so they'll integrate words from the song into that. And that's because their brain can't both pick up what's in the conversation and what's in the song separately. Like it has to sort of integrate it. So the same thing is going to be happening to you when you're talking with somebody, like trying to look at them, or when you're trying to listen to them. Like, so yeah, the brain just can't do both at once. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why like maybe putting down the phone can benefit you, can benefit the way the other person is feeling, can benefit the outcome of the interaction. So.
Yeah. You have to pick between real life and digital life in that moment, right? And I can't do two things at once at all. It's funny that you mentioned that, because that was a thing that I was thinking about, is like I've been watching like even watching a football game and then trying to check my fantasy football at the same time. I'm like, I don't know what's happening right now. I cannot do both at once. And I imagine we probably trick ourselves into thinking that like these two things can kind of coexist, and we really have to be in one space at a time.
Yeah. I mean, like for students, like this is like classic, like, I like to think I'm an okay instructor, but I get students in my class sometimes, maybe more than sometimes, right? They're scrolling through their phone and they think that they're like able to like pay attention and not, but there's tons and tons of research. It's like, no, you just can't recall stuff if you're on your phone in class and you're trying to listen to the instructor. It just doesn't work. Like your brain doesn't have the capacity to do that. So
Schedule some time to put that phone down.
yeah, exactly. Schedule some time to put it down.
Well, thanks for coming in, Kristen.
Yeah, thanks.
It was really good to talk to you. I think it was a great conversation, and I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Yeah, it'll be awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for stopping by the search bar. Make sure that you like and subscribe so that you don't have to search for the next episode.